Catherine Cat Holloway had always believed that life rewarded those who worked hard and kept their heads down. She had spent years building her own business, a small but respected auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. Her reputation wasn't built on flashy advertisements or big-name endorsements, but on sheer grit, skill, and an unyielding dedication to her craft. She could strip an engine down to its bolts and put it back together blindfolded. She knew cars better than most people knew themselves. It was why her shop had a loyal clientele. People trusted her, not just with their vehicles but with their safety. Mechanics like her were rare, honest, reliable, and unwilling to cut corners. She took pride in that, maybe too much. Maybe enough to make her forget that the world didn't always play fair. That night, exhaustion clung to her like grease after a long shift. She had spent the last 13 hours under hoods, covered in oil, fighting with stripped bolts, and dealing with a parts supplier who thought last-minute price hikes were just part of doing business. Her hands ached, her shoulders burned, and all she wanted was to get home, take a long shower, and sleep until morning. The roads were quiet, the kind of eerie silence that only came in the dead of night, when even the city itself seemed to take a breath. Her 1970 Chevy Chevelle rumbled beneath her, a machine she had rebuilt from the ground up. It was more than just a car, it was proof of everything she had fought for. She was only a few miles from home when she noticed the headlights in her rearview mirror. At first, she didn't think much of them. Just another late-night driver on the empty roads. But something felt off. The vehicle behind her, a massive white Cadillac Escalade, was approaching fast, much faster than it should have been. A flicker of unease settled in her chest. It wasn't just the speed, it was the way the SUV swerved slightly, as if the driver wasn't entirely in control. Drunk, maybe. Or distracted. Either way, she didn't like it. She tapped the brakes lightly, signaling for the driver to slow down, but the response was immediate and aggressive. The Escalade lurched forward, closing the gap between them in seconds. Kat's pulse quickened. She wasn't the kind of person who panicked easily. She had dealt with enough reckless drivers, enough close calls in the shop to know when something was going wrong, but this wasn't just reckless. It was intentional. Then, without warning, the Escalade jerked sideways, swerving into her lane. Kat reacted on instinct. She yanked the wheel to the right, tires screeching against the asphalt as she barely avoided being sideswiped. The SUV didn't slow down. If anything, it sped up, now dangerously close to her rear bumper. The roar of its engine filled her ears. The driver wasn't just being careless. They were pushing her, forcing her. "Son of a bitch," she muttered under her breath, gripping the wheel tighter. She knew these roads better than most. If she could just get ahead, take the next sharp turn near the bridge, she could shake them. But before she could make her move, the Escalade rammed into the back of her Chevelle with full force. The impact sent her car skidding violently, her tires struggling for traction. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest as she fought the steering wheel, trying to keep control. But the road was slick, the force too much. Then came the second hit. Harder. Deliberate. The world tilted. Her stomach lurched as metal screamed against metal. She felt herself being thrown sideways as her car spun. For a moment there was no up or down, just a chaotic blur of streetlights and darkness. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the guardrail rushing toward her windshield. Silence. Then pain. A searing, all-consuming ache spread through her ribs, her shoulder, her skull. Her body was pinned, the weight of the seatbelt pressing against her chest. The taste of blood was thick in her mouth, the coppery tang mixing with the acrid scent of burnt rubber. Her vision blurred, a haze of shattered glass and twisted metal surrounding her. Somewhere outside, footsteps crunched against the pavement. A shadow moved past what was left of her windshield. Then a voice, sharp, shrill, entitled. "Oh, for God's sake," the woman groaned. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Kat forced her eyes open. Through the dizziness, she could make out a figure standing just outside her wrecked car. A tall, thin woman with platinum blonde hair, a glittering designer dress, and heels far too high for someone who had just been in an accident. The woman let out an exaggerated sigh, her annoyance dripping from every syllable. Unbelievable. "I cannot believe this is happening to me." Kat tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman didn't seem to notice or care. She pulled out her phone, flipping her hair dramatically before putting on an expression of pure distress, like a soap opera actress overplaying a breakdown. "Hello? Yes, I need police immediately. I was just attacked on the road by some crazy woman. She rammed into me. I'm injured. Oh my God, I think my neck is broken." She paused, rolling her eyes. "Yes, I'm on Hillcrest Drive." "No, I don't know what kind of car it was, something old and ugly. But it's completely destroyed now, so I guess it doesn't matter." Kat's blood ran cold. She was lying. She tried again to move, to force words out, but her body refused to cooperate. The woman turned back toward the wreckage, placing a manicured hand on her hip as she surveyed the damage. "Do you have any idea how much that car cost me?" she snapped, glaring at Kat as if she were a piece of inconvenient trash. "You people are always so reckless." "Jesus. Now I have to deal with this." "You hit me," Kat managed, her voice hoarse. The woman scoffed. "Oh, please. If I had hit you, do you think I'd be standing here perfectly fine?" She waved a dismissive hand. "You came out of nowhere like some crazy road-raging lunatic. But don't worry, I have a very good lawyer. And believe me, sweetheart, you're going to be paying for this." The words barely registered. Kat's head was spinning, her body aching. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a drunk driver. This woman was dangerous, and she had just turned the entire accident against her. The wail of approaching sirens sliced through the heavy silence of the wreckage-strewn road, their distant howls growing louder, filling the air with a cold inevitability. Kat barely had the strength to keep her eyes open, her body still trapped between the crumpled remains of her Chevelle and the seatbelt cutting into her chest, like a vice. Every breath felt like fire licking through her ribs, a deep H8 radiating from her shoulder down to her fingertips. Blood trickled from a gash above her eyebrow, warm and sticky, the metallic taste still thick in her mouth. She was trying to focus, trying to push through the disorientation, but the world refused to stay still, shifting and blurring every time she blinked. She forced herself to inhale through the pain, through the dizziness, as she listened to the rhythmic tapping of high heels pacing near her wrecked car. Well, finally the woman huffed, flipping her hair as she turned toward the flashing lights of the police cruisers screeching to a halt. Her tone was laced with exaggerated relief, her voice rising into the night with the perfect balance of victimized distress and righteous indignation. "I thought I was going to die out here waiting for someone to show up." The tires barely stopped rolling before the first officer stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he took in the two mangled vehicles, his expression shifting from confusion to grim professionalism. He wasn't alone. A second officer moved toward Kat's car, radioing in for paramedics as he assessed the scene. The smell of burned rubber and gasoline was suffocating, thick enough to make the night feel heavier. "I need a paramedic over here," the second officer called, leaning into Kat's crumpled window. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Try not to move." She swallowed, trying to wet her throat enough to respond. But before she could form words, the woman in the designer dress launched into her performance. "Officer, thank God you're here. That lunatic tried to kill me." She clutched her arms, rubbing them, as if she were physically shaking, though her stance remained steady, poised. "I was just driving home when she came out of nowhere, swerving like a maniac. I tried to avoid her, but she lost control and hit me." Kat's pulse pounded in her ears. Her vision was still blurry, but her mind was clearing just enough to register the weight of what was happening. The woman who had been too drunk to stand straight a moment ago was now in complete control, her voice trembling in just the right way, her breath coming in carefully measured shudders. This wasn't panic. This wasn't shock. It was rehearsed. The first officer, a tall, broad man with a hardened face, narrowed his eyes slightly, as if sensing something was off, but he didn't interrupt her. He glanced at the wreckage again, then turned his attention to Kat. "Ma'am, can you confirm what happened?" Kat opened her mouth, but the pain made it impossible to get more than a few syllables out. Her throat felt raw, her body refusing to cooperate, the words forming slower than she could think. "She hit me," she rasped, her voice barely audible. From behind. The woman's gasp was loud and theatrical, her hand flying to her chest like she had just been mortally wounded by the accusation. "Oh my God, are you serious? Officer, she's clearly in shock. She doesn't even know what she's saying. I mean, look at her." The woman gestured toward Kat's bloodied face. "You can't actually believe her. She's obviously just trying to blame me for her reckless driving." Kat forced herself to stay conscious, to push past the pain clouding her mind, but every second that passed made it harder. The officer glanced between them, his face unreadable, then spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, we have one confirmed injury, requesting EMS immediately." He turned back to the woman. "Ma'am, you said she swerved into your lane?" "Yes, she was all over the road." The woman nodded enthusiastically. "I tried to slow down, but she lost control. It was terrifying. I thought I was going to die." Kat clenched her teeth. She could still hear the roar of the Escalade's engine when it had sped up behind her. She could still feel the jolt, the violent impact when it had slammed into her. This woman had been drunk, driving recklessly, and now she was trying to turn the entire thing against her. Kat wasn't naive. She had seen people lie before, had seen them twist situations to suit their narratives, but this was something else. This was calculated. She forced her gaze toward the first officer, her chest rising and falling with strained breaths. "She was speeding," she managed. She hit me from behind. Twice." The woman let out a sharp laugh, the sound laced with amusement and contempt. "Oh, this is unbelievable. She's literally making things up." She turned toward the officer again, her expression shifting into one of practiced exasperation. "Listen, I don't want to press charges or anything. I just want my insurance to handle this. But I am going to need a police report. My lawyer is going to be furious when he hears about this." The officer nodded, making notes on his pad. "Have either of you been drinking tonight?" Kat barely had the energy to shake her head, but the woman didn't hesitate. "I had one glass of wine at dinner, hours ago." It was a lie. Kat knew it. The way she had stumbled out of the Escalade, the way she had slurred her words when she first started shouting at her, the strong smell of alcohol on her breath, it was obvious. But Kat was in no position to argue, not like this. The officer motioned toward his partner. "We're going to conduct a field sobriety test." The woman didn't even flinch. Instead, she smirked. "Oh, officer, that won't be necessary. My husband is actually a well-known attorney. He would never forgive me if I took one of those ridiculous tests when I'm completely fine." The name she dropped must have meant something, because the first officer's jaw tightened slightly before he lowered his notepad and looked away. Kat's stomach dropped. That was it. That was the moment everything tilted. The officer turned back toward her. "We'll let the insurance companies handle the rest. Paramedics will be here soon. Try to stay still." And just like that, it was over. Kat lay there, heart hammering against her ribs, watching as the woman casually pulled out her phone and started texting, a smug smile tugging at her lips. It hit Kat like a freight train. This woman wasn't just going to get away with it. She was going to win. And then, as if to hammer the final nail in, the woman glanced back down at her, her voice low enough that only Kat could hear. "You're going to regret this, sweetheart." The words slithered into the night like a promise. A warning. Kat exhaled shakily, staring up at the flashing lights as the world around her collapsed. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion, a sterile, suffocating mix that clung to the back of Kat's throat as she forced herself to stay awake. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, their harsh fluorescence pressing against her skull, making her headache even worse. Her body ached in places she hadn't even realized had been injured, each breath a reminder that she had been inside that car when it had been sent spinning across the asphalt like a discarded toy. The doctors had ruled out any internal bleeding, but she had suffered a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, and 3 cracked ribs. They had wanted to keep her overnight for observation, but she had refused. Hospitals weren't places for people like her, people who had too much to lose and no one to advocate for them. She had signed the discharge papers with hands that still trembled from the lingering shock of the accident, ignored the nurse's disapproving frown, and left the ER with nothing but a bottle of painkillers and a warning to take it easy. But Kat didn't have the luxury of taking it easy. She had barely made it home when the first hit came. The thick envelope sat waiting for her in the mailbox, its crisp, legal weight paper standing out against the usual pile of junk mail and bills. Her name was printed in bold, precise letters across the front. No return address, just the cold, impersonal weight of something meant to ruin her life. She had known before she even opened it that it was from her. The papers inside were neatly stacked, stapled together at the corner with the kind of methodical cruelty that only expensive lawyers could achieve. She skimmed the first page, eyes scanning over the sharp, unforgiving words that cut deeper than any wound from the crash. Personal injury lawsuit. Plaintiff Karen Dalton. Defendant Catherine Holloway. She didn't need to read the rest to understand exactly what was happening. Karen wasn't just lying to the police anymore. She was trying to financially destroy her. Her stomach twisted as she forced herself to go through the details. Karen was claiming that the crash had caused her severe emotional distress, that she had suffered a neck injury that would require long-term physical therapy, and that Kat's reckless driving had put her life in danger. She was demanding $150,000 in damages, plus an additional $50,000 for lost wages, citing that she had been too traumatized to return to work. Kat let out a short, bitter laugh at that. As if Karen had ever worked a day in her life. The lawsuit wasn't just an attack. It was a message. A warning that this woman wasn't going to stop until she had taken everything from her. Kat's hands clenched around the papers, her fingers pressing so tightly into the thick paper that it nearly tore. She needed to think. She needed to act. The weight of what was happening pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. She was barely keeping her shop afloat as it was. If she lost this case, if the court sided with Karen, she would be ruined. The kind of ruin you didn't come back from. She grabbed her phone, her fingers stiff and aching as she scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. James Hill, her lawyer. She had never needed him for more than the occasional business contract, never had to rely on him for anything major. But now he was the only thing standing between her and complete destruction. She barely had the energy to speak when he picked up. "I need your help," she said, her voice raw from exhaustion and pain. "I just got served." There was a pause, then a sharp inhale. "Tell me everything," James said, his tone immediately shifting into something more focused, more precise. She could hear the rustling of papers in the background, the unmistakable sound of someone already preparing for war. She told him everything. About the accident, about Karen, about the lawsuit and the blatant lies she had fed to the police. James listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes as she spoke. When she finally finished, there was a long silence before he exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, "first things first. We don't panic. This is bad, but it's not impossible to fight. I've dealt with cases like this before. What we need to do is build your defense before they have the chance to gain any traction." Kat leaned against the kitchen counter, pressing her fingers against her temples as she tried to force her thoughts into something coherent. "How?" "We start by tearing apart her claims," James said. "She's saying she suffered a neck injury, right? That she can't work." "Yeah, good," he said. "Because I guarantee you, someone like Karen Dalton isn't the type to sit quietly at home and recover. We find proof that she's lying, social media posts, witnesses, security footage, anything that contradicts her statement. If we can prove that she's been out shopping, at parties, drinking at expensive restaurants, then her case falls apart. Judges don't like liars, especially ones who try to milk the system." Kat exhaled shakily. "And if we can't find anything?" "Then we make sure they can't prove she's telling the truth," James said simply. "If there's no medical documentation supporting her claim, no legitimate doctor willing to testify on her behalf, then all she has is a sob story. And that won't be enough to win in court." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. It wasn't much, but it was a plan. A starting point. And right now that was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. But the hits kept coming. The next morning she woke up to find her business under investigation. An anonymous complaint had been filed against her shop, citing unsafe working conditions and fraudulent business practices within hours. An inspector showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable as he began going through every inch of her garage. He questioned her employees, took photos, checked permits, as if he was already looking for something to shut her down. She barely had time to deal with that when the calls started coming in. Clients canceling appointments. Regulars suddenly finding another place to take their cars. People whispering that they had heard things about her shop, about her, that maybe she wasn't as trustworthy as they had thought. It wasn't a coincidence. Karen was trying to destroy her piece by piece, attacking her from every angle. She wasn't just suing her. She was trying to make sure that even if Kat somehow survived the lawsuit, she would be left with nothing. Kat gritted her teeth, a cold, burning anger settling in her chest. She had spent her entire life building something out of nothing, clawing her way up, fighting for every single thing she had. She had made mistakes, had stumbled, but she had never backed down from a fight, and she wasn't about to start now. Karen thought she had already won, that she could crush her without resistance. But Karen was wrong. Kat wasn't going to break. She was going to fight. And she was going to make that woman regret ever crossing her. Kat sat at her desk in the back office of the shop, her laptop open, her phone resting beside her, buzzing intermittently with calls she refused to answer. The numbers were unfamiliar, but she knew exactly who they were from reporters sniffing around the lawsuit, Karen's people trying to intimidate her, insurance agents looking for statements that could be twisted against her. She ignored all of them. She had bigger problems. The investigation into her shop had stalled business, and the lawsuit loomed over her like a loaded gun pressed to the back of her skull, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. She had spent the last week pulling every piece of information she could find on Karen Dalton, but the woman was careful, calculated. Her public image was spotless, a carefully curated display of charity events, expensive vacations, and high society gatherings. If she was faking an injury, she wasn't making it easy to prove. James had been relentless, digging through every record he could access, calling in favors from private investigators and forensic accountants, but so far, nothing solid had emerged. It was infuriating. Kat knew Karen was lying. She knew she was being set up, manipulated, pushed toward financial ruin by a woman who had done this before, who had perfected the art of legal warfare. And yet every move they made seemed to be countered before it could gain traction. Witnesses who had originally been willing to vouch for Kat suddenly stopped returning calls. The shop's security footage from the week leading up to the accident had mysteriously vanished from the cloud storage. Even her bank had flagged her account for unusual activity, freezing one of her business transactions under the pretense of security concerns. Karen was connected. More connected than Kat had realized. James finally called late in the evening, his voice tight with exhaustion. "I've got something," he said, but he didn't sound victorious. If anything, he sounded frustrated. "It's not enough, but it's something." She filed an insurance claim for damages on her Escalade 2 months ago. Minor fender bender in a parking garage. Normally that wouldn't matter, but the damage report listed structural concerns related to prior incidents. Kat frowned, rubbing at her temple. Meaning that if those prior incidents were bad enough, there should have been existing medical records. But there's nothing. No hospital visits, no claims, nothing that would back up her current lawsuit. If she was injured so severely in your accident, why isn't there any record of previous issues? And here's the interesting part: she went to a chiropractor 3 weeks ago. Not a hospital. A chiropractor. Kat felt a flicker of something, hope, maybe. So she's building a case, laying groundwork. That's my guess. And it means she's got a doctor willing to play along. James exhaled slowly. Look, this isn't a smoking gun, but it tells us something important. She's not just making this up on the fly. She planned this. She was looking for the right target, waiting for the right moment. Kat gritted her teeth. And I gave it to her. Not intentionally, James said, but it didn't change the fact that she had walked straight into the trap. That night, Kat couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment of impact, the blinding headlights, the screech of metal against pavement, the sickening lurch of her car being thrown off course. She felt the weight of the seatbelt cutting into her ribs, the airbags slamming into her face, the moment of sheer helplessness as the world spun around her. But it wasn't just the accident that haunted her. It was the smirk on Karen's face when she had whispered those final words, that quiet, smug confidence that came from knowing she had already won. Kat refused to let that be true. The next morning, she met James at his office, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. He had spent the night digging deeper, and it showed in the dark circles under his eyes, the stiffness in his posture. "I pulled the court records on Karen's previous lawsuits," he said, dropping a thick file onto the desk between them. "She's done this before. Twice. Both cases settled out of court, both under different names. Her maiden name and her first married name." Kat flipped through the pages, skimming the details. The patterns were disturbingly familiar: minor accidents turned into major lawsuits, exaggerated injuries, financial settlements that conveniently avoided actual court trials. Why isn't this public? Because she's careful. She targets people who can't afford to fight back. Both cases ended in settlements because the defendants were small business owners who couldn't afford to go to trial. She drains them financially until they have no choice but to give in. James met her eyes. "That's what she's doing to you. But you're different. You're fighting." Kat's jaw tightened. "And I'm not settling." "Good. Because I also found something else." James leaned forward, his voice lowering slightly. "Her husband's law firm? The one she keeps mentioning? He's not with them anymore. He was fired last year for embezzlement. But Karen still uses his name, still throws it around like it carries weight. She's bluffing. She wants people to think she has power, influence, but in reality, she's hanging by a thread." Kat exhaled slowly, processing the information. "So if I push back hard enough," she cracks. James finished. "But we have to be smart about it. We need something undeniable. Something that forces her into a position she can't manipulate." Kat knew exactly what that meant. Evidence. Proof that she was lying, that her entire case was built on a foundation of fraud. And there was only one way to get it. They had to catch her in the act. James arranged for a private investigator to start tracking Karen's movements, watching for any sign that contradicted her claims of being too injured to function. It was a long shot, but it was their best hope. Meanwhile, Kat focused on salvaging her business, reassuring clients, and trying to restore the trust that had been shaken by Karen's smear campaign. It wasn't easy. Every day felt like a battle, every small victory overshadowed by the looming threat of the trial. Then, 3 days later, James called. "We got her," he said, and for the first time in weeks, Kat heard something in his voice that had been missing before: satisfaction. Karen had been seen at a high-end country club playing tennis. Not just playing, but moving without hesitation, without restraint. Laughing, drinking, living her life as if nothing was wrong. James sent Kat the footage: clear, indisputable video evidence of a woman who was supposed to be too injured to sit upright for long periods, sprinting across a tennis court in designer sportswear. It was exactly what they needed. Kat watched the video 3 times before allowing herself to breathe again. This was it. The turning point. The moment the tide shifted. Karen thought she had control. She thought she was untouchable. But she was wrong. For the first time since the crash, Kat felt something other than exhaustion, other than anger. She felt like she was about to win. Kat had always believed that when people were backed into a corner, they either folded or fought. She had seen it time and time again with customers at the shop, with desperate people trying to fix their cars on a budget, with debt collectors breathing down their necks, with old men who didn't want to admit they had wrecked their transmissions because they refused to let someone younger tell them how to drive. People reacted one of 2 ways: they either gave up or they lashed out. And Karen Dalton was not the type to give up. Kat knew it before she even saw the message, before she even picked up the phone and heard James' voice, that clipped, measured tone that told her things were about to get worse. "She knows," he said without preamble. About the video, Kat exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her temple. How? Someone tipped her off. Maybe one of the club staff, maybe one of her friends. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that she's moving fast. Her legal team just filed an emergency motion to dismiss our counterclaim, citing irrelevant and misleading surveillance tactics meant to harass an injured party, and if that wasn't bad enough, She's doubled down on her suit against you. She's added another 50 grand in damages, claiming your public attacks have caused her undue mental distress. Kat let out a short, humorless laugh, pacing the length of her living room as the weight of it all settled over her like a lead blanket. So let me get this straight. We catch her faking an injury, and her response is to accuse me of harassment. Essentially, James said, his voice edged with frustration. She's trying to get ahead of it. If she can discredit the footage before we present it, it weakens our position. And that's not all. She also got a judge to approve an injunction against you. You can't publicly discuss the case anymore. That includes releasing the footage or even mentioning it to potential witnesses. Kat stopped pacing, the words slamming into her harder than she expected. You're joking. I wish I was, James muttered. She's throwing everything she has at you, and she's got just enough pull left in this town to make things stick. But she's not invincible. We still have the footage, and we still have leverage. She's just trying to make sure we don't use it before she can bury you in legal fees. Kat clenched her jaw, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She had expected Karen to fight back, but she hadn't expected her to escalate this fast, this aggressively. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was personal. Karen wanted to destroy her, to make an example out of her. And Kat refused to let that happen. 2 days later, the first real sign of retaliation arrived. She was locking up the shop for the night when she noticed the car. A sleek black Mercedes idling across the street, engine humming low in the darkness. She knew better than to ignore it. The moment she turned toward it, the headlights flashed once, briefly illuminating the driver's face. A man in an expensive suit, watching her with the kind of detached interest that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't get out of the car. He didn't need to. The message was clear enough. They were watching her. By the time she got home, her adrenaline was still pumping, her mind racing through every possible worst-case scenario. James had warned her that Karen played dirty, but this wasn't just legal maneuvering anymore. This was intimidation. She double-checked the locks, made sure the security cameras were running, and forced herself to take slow, measured breaths. She would not be scared out of her own damn life. Then the power cut out. For a split second, she thought it was a coincidence, a storm knocking down a power line somewhere. But as she stood there in the sudden, suffocating dark, a cold certainty settled in her gut. This wasn't an accident. This was another message. Her phone still had charge, and she wasted no time calling James. She's escalating, she said the second he answered. I've got people watching me, and now my power's been cut. This isn't just about court anymore. James cursed under his breath. She's trying to rattle you. Don't let her. Stay inside, keep your doors locked, and don't engage. I'll make some calls. Kat forced herself to stay calm, to push down the urge to go outside and confront whoever was responsible. That was what they wanted. For her to make a mistake. For her to make a mistake. For her to give them an excuse to paint her as the aggressor. She wasn't going to give them that. The next morning, her security cameras confirmed what she already knew. 2 men in dark clothing had cut across her backyard, disappearing toward the power box behind the garage. No faces, no identifying marks. Just shadows moving with purpose. James took one look at the footage and called in a favor. Within hours, Kat had a restraining order against Karen and any known associates. Not that it would stop them from finding other ways to mess with her. But it was something. A line drawn in the sand. And then, just when she thought things couldn't get worse, they did. She arrived at the shop that afternoon to find a city inspector waiting for her, clipboard in hand, face unreadable, as he informed her that her business license was under review. Someone had filed a complaint, citing unsafe working conditions and improper handling of hazardous materials. She knew exactly who that someone was. Karen was trying to shut her down. The inspection was brutal. Every inch of the shop was scrutinized, every permit double-checked. Kat followed the inspector through the garage, answering his questions with as much restraint as she could muster, but her patience was wearing thin. This wasn't about safety. It was about drowning her in bureaucracy, about making her fight so many battles at once that she wouldn't have the energy left to win the war. When the inspector finally left, James was waiting in her office, arms crossed, expression tight. "She's running out of options," he said. "That's why she's coming at you from every angle. She knows we have her, and she's panicking." Kat let out a slow breath, sinking into the chair across from him. "Then why does it feel like she's still winning?" "Because she hasn't lost yet," James said. "But she will. We're getting close, Kat. And when we hit her, we hit hard." The next day, the investigator tailing Karen sent them a new report. She had been spotted meeting with a man at a private law firm downtown. A fixer, someone who specialized in making problems disappear. Kat didn't know what she was planning, but she wasn't about to sit around and wait to find out. It was time to go on the offensive. James pulled every favor he had left, every connection, every legal loophole he could find. And then, finally, the break they had been waiting for came. A former employee from Karen's previous lawsuits agreed to testify. Someone who had seen her fabricate injuries before, someone who knew exactly how she operated. It was the beginning of the end. And Karen Dalton had no idea what was coming. The courtroom was colder than Kat had expected, the air thick with the low hum of murmured conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the polished wood of the judge's bench and the rows of stiff-backed chairs lining the walls. It felt clinical, lifeless, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions twisting inside her chest. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, countering every move Karen had made, enduring the relentless attacks against her business, her reputation, her very sanity. And now, finally, the end was in sight. Karen sat across from her, poised and elegant in an expensive navy blue suit, her blonde hair styled into soft waves, her expression the perfect blend of practiced sadness and restrained indignation. She played the role well, the grieving victim of a reckless driver, a woman whose life had been so cruelly upended by Kat's supposed negligence. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her nails freshly manicured, not a trace of injury visible on her body. And yet, according to her lawsuit, she was a woman in unbearable pain, unable to work, unable to enjoy life the way she once had. Kat clenched her jaw, forcing her breathing to stay even as the judge entered and called the court to order. James sat beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. He had been unrelenting these past few weeks, dissecting Karen's claims with surgical precision, anticipating every trick her legal team might try to pull. They had spent hours rehearsing for this, preparing for every possible scenario, but now that they were here, the weight of it all settled heavy on Kat's shoulders. If they lost, she lost everything. If they won, it wouldn't just be a victory, it would be justice. Karen's lawyer, a man with a voice like sandpaper and the smug confidence of someone used to getting his way, began his opening statement with the usual theatrics. He painted Karen as a woman who had suffered unimaginable hardship, who had once lived a full and vibrant life but was now reduced to a shell of herself due to Kat's reckless and irresponsible actions. He described her pain in excruciating detail, listing off supposed medical conditions that had resulted from the crash, recounting the numerous treatments she had undergone. Kat listened in silence, her nails digging into the armrest of her chair, knowing every word was a lie, every fabricated injury a carefully constructed piece of a long-standing scam. When it was James' turn, he rose with the kind of deliberate calm that sent a ripple of unease through the opposing side. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't launch into impassioned speeches. He simply laid out the facts, one by one, methodical, relentless. He presented the footage of Karen playing tennis, her movements fluid and unrestrained, her supposed injuries nowhere in sight. He showed photographs of her attending social events, standing in heels, laughing, drinking, without a single sign of the debilitating pain she claimed to be suffering from. And then, finally, he introduced their witness. The former paralegal from one of Karen's previous lawsuits took the stand, her voice steady as she described how Karen had orchestrated identical lawsuits in the past, how she had intentionally sought out minor accidents that she could exploit for financial gain. She detailed how Karen had pressured doctors into falsifying medical records, how she had settled out of court just before trials could expose her scams, how she had left a trail of ruined businesses and destroyed reputations in her wake. Karen's expression barely wavered, but Kat saw the tension in her shoulders, the flicker of something sharp and dangerous in her eyes as the truth began to unravel around her. She had spent years perfecting this game, manipulating the system, bending it to her will. But this time she had underestimated her opponent. James delivered the final blow with financial records, linking Karen's mounting debts to her sudden need for a massive payout. She wasn't just scamming Kat, she was desperate. This lawsuit wasn't just another con. It was her last chance to stay afloat before everything collapsed around her. The courtroom was silent when James finished, the weight of the evidence settling over the room like a suffocating fog. Karen's lawyer tried to salvage what he could, but it was useless. The judge was already looking at Karen with thinly veiled contempt, her patience for the charade worn thin. When the ruling came down, it was swift and brutal. Kat was cleared of all charges. The lawsuit was dismissed, and Karen Dalton was charged with fraud and perjury. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Kat breathed. She barely registered the way Karen's face twisted in rage, the way she snapped at her lawyer, demanding he do something, anything to fix this. But there was nothing left to fix. Her empire of lies had finally crumbled beneath her. Kat stood, exhaling slowly as she turned toward James. He met her gaze with a small, satisfied nod, and for the first time in weeks she felt something other than exhaustion. She felt free. The air outside the courthouse was crisp, carrying the distant hum of city traffic, and the low murmurs of reporters still gathered near the steps, their cameras turned toward Karen Dalton as she stormed past them, her face a tight mask of barely concealed rage. Her once perfectly curated image had finally shattered, and she was doing everything in her power to ignore the reality of what had just happened. The moment the ruling had been announced, she had bolted from the courtroom, her lawyer trailing behind her, his face a shade paler than before. The weight of fraud and perjury charges now loomed over her, and there was no amount of legal maneuvering that could erase what had just been exposed in front of a judge. For the first time since this nightmare had started, Karen was the one losing control. Kat didn't watch her leave. She didn't need to. The victory wasn't in seeing Karen fall apart, it was in knowing she had fought back and won. The exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones over the last few months was still there, lingering like an old wound, but it was lighter now. The constant weight pressing down on her had lifted, even if the scars it left behind wouldn't fade overnight. James stood beside her, flipping through his notes one last time before snapping the folder shut with a satisfied sigh. "You did it," he said, the edges of a rare smile tugging at his lips. "I told you we'd get her." Kat exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. "Yeah, I just didn't think it would feel like this." "Like what?" She thought about it for a moment, about the months of fighting, of clawing her way out of the trap Karen had set for her, about how every battle had been a test of how much she could endure. She had been ready for relief, for some kind of euphoric triumph. But all she felt now was a quiet, steady calm, the kind that came when you walked away from a war zone and realized, for the first time, that the bullets had finally stopped flying. "Like I can breathe again," she said finally. James nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "It's over," he said. "For now." She gave him a sideways look. "For now." He shrugged. "She's going to fight the fraud charges. People like her don't just roll over and accept consequences." Kat smirked. "Good. Let her fight. Maybe for once she'll know what it feels like to lose everything she worked for." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." She smiled, the first real, unguarded smile she had allowed herself in what felt like years. For the first time since the crash, she wasn't bracing for the next attack. She wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. That night, she returned to her shop for the first time in what felt like weeks, stepping inside and inhaling the familiar scent of motor oil and metal, the hum of overhead lights buzzing softly in the silence. The garage was empty, but it was hers again. No investigators snooping around, no baseless complaints hanging over her head like a death sentence. The damage Karen had done to her business wasn't something that would heal overnight. She had lost clients, lost money, lost time. But what mattered was that she still had it. Karen had tried to take everything from her, and she had failed. She walked over to the Chevelle, running her hand along the smooth, freshly repainted surface. It had taken weeks to repair, to undo the damage from the crash. But it was whole again, and so was she. A knock at the open garage door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find one of her regular clients, an older man who had been bringing his truck to her for years, standing just outside with a cautious smile. "I heard you were back," he said. Kat wiped her hands on her jeans and leaned against the workbench. "Yeah, guess I am." He hesitated for a moment, then glanced at the Chevelle. "Looks good. You did a hell of a job fixing her up." She ran her fingers over the hood, feeling the familiar cool metal beneath her fingertips. She deserved a second chance. The man nodded, then motioned toward his truck parked outside. "Well, since you're open again, think you can take a look at my transmission? Damn thing's been slipping for weeks." Kat grinned, pushing off the workbench. "You bring it in, I'll fix it." And just like that, life moved forward. The war with Karen was over, but the world kept turning. Clients still needed their cars fixed, engines still needed tuning, and bills still needed to be paid. But for the first time in months, she wasn't fighting to survive. She was just living again.